I wanted to begin this tribute just by reading the obituary. It'll maybe provide a context for what will follow. This was published in the Chattanooga Times Free Press, and it was written by Allan Gagne, I've been told by Marcy. Robert Mills Gagne, 85, Signal Mountain, died Sunday, April 28, 2002. He was a leader in the fields of educational psychology and instructional design. He was born in 1916 in North Andover, Massachusetts. After receiving his Bachelor of Arts degree from Yale University in 1937, he went on to Brown University to earn a doctorate in experimental psychology in 1940. He spent much of his 50-year career in academic positions at Connecticut College for Women, Princeton University, University of California at Berkeley, and Florida State University. From 1962 to 66, he was Director of Research at the American Institutes for Research in Pittsburgh. Mr. Gagne also spent a good portion of his career working on military training problems. During World War II, Mr. Gagne served as an aviation psychologist, developing tests for classification of aircrew. From 1950 to 1958, he was technical director for two different Air Force laboratories at Lackland and Lowry Air Force bases, where he conducted numerous studies of human learning and performance. At the end of his career, in 1990 and 1991, he worked on instructional design models for military training at Armstrong Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. During his career, Mr. Gagne never wavered from the idealistic vision of psychology that he expressed in his 1932 valedictory speech at Johnson High School in North Andover, in which he said the science of psychology should be used to relieve the burdens of human life. His research and writing focused on how principles of human learning established through scientific research could be applied in education and training. He wrote 5 editions of a seminal book entitled The Conditions of Learning, and he also wrote numerous other books on principles of learning and instructional design. Mr. Gagne was a member of Phi Beta Kappa and Sigma Chi and was a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the National Academy of Education. In recognition of his contributions, Mr. Gagne received many honors, including the Phi Delta Kappa Award for Distinguished Educational Research from AERA and the Distinguished Scientific Award for Applications of Psychology from the American Psychological Association. Mr. Gagne is survived by his wife Harriet, Pat, 2 children, Sam and Ellen, and 2 grandchildren. And then it ends with a note about the memorial service. So that's the context why we're here today. I just came from the D&D luncheon where we recognized and really celebrated the contributions of different people in our field. And we really want to continue that today. So the point of this session is to recognize the contributions, to celebrate the fact that he contributed so much, and to remember who he was. I think, Marcy, you're going to explain how we organize this.
Okay. As Mike and I were talking about what we'd like to do, we kind of wondered, well, maybe a way to bring the personal side of Gagne also, as well as the professional side, would be to involve people who worked with him over his career. And so in a sense, this is almost chronological. We'll ask Bob Morgan to speak, who was the person who was responsible for bringing Bob Gagne to Florida State. Stuart Weinstein, who was a student at Florida State while Gagne was there and who worked with him on projects, and Gagne's served on Stuart's dissertation committee. I had the fortunate opportunity not only to write with Bob, which is true of many of his colleagues at Florida State, but also to teach with him. And so in some respects, I have some stories to share that are probably somewhat unique. Then Mike will say a few words. He worked with Bob after Bob retired from Florida State at the Army Research Institute. And then Dave Merrill will round us out by talking about some of the work that he and Bob did. They've had, some of you may know, debates that have been published in Educational Technology magazine, and I think actually some videotapes of some of those things as well. So we think we've got a well-rounded memory of Bob Gagne. So without any additional word at this time, I'd like to introduce Bob Morgan. Bob is the Director Emeritus of the Learning Systems Institute. He is the person who established the department that I now chair at Florida State, and he was really responsible for bringing a lot of folks to Florida State to build that program, and of course the one that we're remembering today, Bob Gagne. Dr. Morgan.
Thanks, Marcy. I'd like to start out like Michael did and read a little bit. I was asked by Bob to write the foreword to one of his last books, about 50 years of his own research, which was remarkable that anybody could put together a book with his own articles over a half-century period. And if you haven't seen that book, it's available from FSU, and is really quite nice. He writes connective narrative from his first research article, which started in 1939. The book was published in '89. And this is a coherent building sequence of research that has made an enormous contribution. In any case, he asked me to write the foreword, and I was a bit intimidated by that, and also somewhat awed. And I'll just read parts of it to you as quickly as I can. I'm honored to have been asked by Professor Gagne to write the foreword of his latest book. Having known Bob for roughly half of his 50 years of professional work, it is tempting to use these few paragraphs to tell Gagne stories, of which there are many. I'll get to a couple later. I will attempt to resist this here, however. Given the deep respect, admiration, and affection that all who know Bob Gagne feel for him, it would be easy to make this note a testimonial. When Bob Gagne joined the Department of Research at Florida State University in 1969, the department was small, reasonably good, but not well known nationally. With his arrival, the last condition changed. The program became instantly visible, if for no other reason than his presence. In the ensuing years, the department has grown in size and recognized quality. It has developed one of the nation's strongest graduate training programs in the field of instructional systems and technology, and has become a leader in applied learning research. The intellectual leadership for this development has been provided by Bob Gagne. He has served as an inspiration and model for all of us on the faculty. He is senior both in professional standing and in age, and his scholarly production set a high standard for both the faculty and students. He has been a giant among us, but with his gentle humility and courtesy, he never made any of us feel less worthy. On the contrary, he made us believe that as individuals, we were important and capable of significant intellectual contributions. As a department faculty, he made us feel that we were destined for greatness, which was perhaps not realistic, but it did cause us to do our best. In 1980, Bob was named the Robert O. Lawton Distinguished Professor, the university's highest award for academic achievement, a symbolic acknowledgement by the university's indebtedness to him. This book is a selected combination of a half-century's work, is a capstone to a truly remarkable career. During the past 50 years, Bob's worked unswervingly on the problems of human learning. His studies have ranged from basic to applied and have examined virtually all the variables associated with the learning process. It is rare scholarship that retains its relevance and timeliness over so many years. It is an extraordinary researcher whose lifetime of work is so coherent and logically sequenced, with each new inquiry building upon and extending his previous research findings. Many of the pioneers in the field of instructional systems hold doctorates in experimental psychology and are thoroughly grounded in the fundamentals of learning research. With the many other things on the ISD training agenda, the basics of behavioral science have often been moved to the back burner. However desirable, it is not practical to replicate with new ISD students the breadth and depth of understanding of learning theory and research experienced by those scholars whose foundations were built in psychology. With this new book, Gagne has provided a convenient and manageable remedy for this deficiency. I first became aware of Dr. Gagne when I was a baby assistant professor at the University of New Mexico in 1959, teaching half of the department's graduate courses. That book was Psychology and Human Performance, co-written with Ed Fleshman. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that book or not, but it's an absolute delight to read. It's crystal clear, it's unambiguous, it's elegantly written, the prose is superb, and I thought it was an exemplar of the way that psychologists ought to write and the nature that our discipline ought to have. In 1965, he came out with The Conditions of Learning, another book that I eagerly read and was much influenced by. And as Mike has said, it's through 5 or 6 editions at the present time and published in over 20 languages. I hadn't met him, but I felt like I knew him. And in 1966, I was able to meet him for the first time. He was a member of the National Curriculum Advisory Committee when I was in the U.S. Office of Education, and I was serving as staff support for that committee, and I met him for the first time at that session. And I looked forward to it with awe, having no idea what kind of a person he was as an individual. And by then I had known a few of the biggies in our field and found that most of them were relatively insensitive to the awe and admiration in which they were held by juniors like me. And as a matter of fact, many of them were quite arrogant. Bob was the absolute opposite of that. He was humble, he was kind, and he was gentle. He was slow to anger, I might note parenthetically here, but when he was enraged, it was an awesome sight. I only saw that 2 or 3 times in the many years that I knew him. One was at the Curriculum Advisory Council when a very learned professor from Columbia University was holding forth about the evils of trying to objectify learning outcomes with statements of behavioral objectives or learning objectives. And Bob sat, and I was right next to him, and I could see him begin to squirm. And finally, he leaped up from his chair, pounded the table, and said, "I'll listen to no more of this nonsense from a man who knows nothing about what he's speaking." And, fortunately, it was almost lunchtime, and there was deadly silence, and the chair adjourned the meeting until after. And I thought, this man merits my admiration. I might tell you a little bit how we attracted him from Berkeley to Florida State University in 1969. We don't hire an awful lot of people from Harvard or Berkeley at Florida State University, at least not in those days. And I had just been hired there from the Office of Education to serve as the chair of the Department of Educational Research. And it was the dean at that time had the ambitions of developing the first instructional systems and technology program in the United States, and brought me in to assist with that endeavor. And after we had negotiated the appointment and I had accepted it, he said, "Let me say to you that I'd like to back up my commitment on this by giving you 4 new full professor positions to fill." That had not happened before then. I suspect it has not happened since. And I was absolutely delighted. He said, "If you have 4 eminent people that you can hire, who would you hire? Who will you try to hire?" And I said, "Well, the first person would be Leslie Briggs, who at that time was director of the American Institutes of Research in Palo Alto." I said, "Then Thorwald Espenson, the deputy superintendent of schools in Duluth, who was a pioneer in individualized instruction, and Bob Branson, who was then with Litton Industries and certainly one of the pioneers in educational systems development." And I said, "Finally, Robert Gagne at the University of California in Berkeley." The dean paused a moment. He said, "You really know Gagne?" And I said, "Oh, yeah." I bragged about it. And he said, "Well, go to it." Well, it turns out that Briggs quickly accepted the offer, as did Bob Branson and Thorwald Espenson. And I didn't know about Gagne because he was pretty happily and securely situated here at Berkeley. So when I got back to the Office of Education in Washington, I called him. And I said, "Bob, shortly, I'm calling you to alert you to something." I said, "Shortly you're going to be hearing rumors that you're going to be moving to Florida State University." He laughed. And I said, I don't want to really talk with you about it today, but the facts are I'm calling you so you won't buy any more property in California, because in fact you will be moving to Florida State University this coming year." And he roared and said, "I'm too old to move. I like it at Berkeley. We own riverside property on the Russian River in California, but thanks for thinking about me in any case." I said, "As I said, I don't want to talk with you about it today, but I would like to meet with you at an upcoming AERA meeting." This was probably in late July, early August that I talked to him, and the AERA was meeting, I believe, in the fall of that year. And he said, sure, I'll be glad to get with you. So Bob Branson and I locked ourselves away in a hotel room with him, and we told him about the ambitions we had for this new program, the kind of research we were going to mount, and the doctoral training program that we intended to develop, and about the other people who had already agreed to come. And he had been a close colleague and friend of Leslie Briggs, so I knew that there was a great deal of mutual respect there. And he was resisting our persuasion and blandishments, and I might say I'm pretty persuasive, but I didn't feel I was getting anywhere. And we talked, salary wasn't an issue. We talked for quite a long time, and I was about to give up. And finally it was Bob Branson that said, Bob, at Berkeley, when you're talking about your applied learning research and you're beginning work in systems, who are your close colleagues? Who do you talk to? Who do you share your thoughts with? Who do you get to criticize your ideas? And there was this long pause, and you realized that there really wasn't anybody at Berkeley with whom Bob had that kind of a collegial relationship. He closed the meeting by saying, well, I'll talk to Pat about it, and we'll think about it, and I'll let you know. Next week I got a call from him, and he said, is the offer still open? And I said, yes. And he said, maybe we ought to talk about salary. So we did for a little bit. Some people thought we bought Bob from Berkeley, but we didn't. We gave him the standard increase over what people got on their existing salaries. And he agreed to come, and he did. After he arrived at FSU, he said, you know, one thing I ought to tell you, Morgan, he said, I'm going to slow down. He said, I have been very productive this past 25 years, but I can't keep up that pace. He said, I'm 50-some years old. He said, I'm going to have to slow the pace down. And I thought, oh, Christ. You know, I've hired a genuine biggie, and now he's going to come to Florida and retire in the sunshine. Well, it turns out that wasn't the case. When we had his retirement dinner a few years ago at Florida State, just before he left Tallahassee for Signal Mountain, Tennessee, I remembered that statement. And I thought, my God, he didn't slow down at all, I don't think. But I'll check it. It's an empirical data issue. And I went back and I actually counted his publications from that 1940 publication up until 1969. He came to FSU, and then from 69 till his retirement in the early 90s. And his per year production was actually higher during the years he was at FSU than it was in the preceding years. And he published with almost everybody on the faculty except me. Never invited me to co-publish, which tells you what an astute and wise person he was. He was certainly the bulwark, the foundation, personally and intellectually, of our program at FSU. There's no replacing of Bob Gagne or a Leslie Briggs, but we still try. And let me close by saying that he was one of my oldest and closest friends, and we miss him every day. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. For the student perspective, I'd like to turn to Stuart Weinstein, who is now a senior associate at Booz Allen Hamilton, and is working with the Project Management Office of President Bush's e-learning or e-government initiative. Stuart.
First of all, I wanted to tell you that I'm very honored to be representing all of the graduate students who have worked with Dr. Gagne, who've had him as a professor on a committee or worked with him as a student. Many of those folks have gone into commercial, military, and academia, so he's inspired a lot of people. And it's interesting you say about, do you really know Gagne? I think that happens to me a lot, and probably a lot of my colleagues, a lot of students who have known him have said, do you really know Gagne? I mean, he spoke with you? And I said, he did indeed speak with me. Actually, he was a very fine scholar and mentor, but he's very, very approachable. I received my PhD from Florida State 23 years ago, and fortunately, there's still a lot of people who are using Dr. Gagne's books, so that keeps that alive. He was one of my committee members. He was my boss, and I'm going to tell you some Gagne stories too about working with him. Most of these are not really curriculum oriented. They're not how he did his teaching, but basically how he related to a lot of the folks that he worked with. I worked with him, first of all, on a very major project, which was with WGBH in Boston, Nova Science Series programs, which is on public television. And another graduate student of mine, David Owens, who also has a background in television production as I did, and Dr. Ernest Berkman, who was my major professor and also had a strong background in science education, were part of the team. One of the three programs dealt with the overfishing of high fish population areas off the coast of Peru. Another program dealt with the misuse of pesticides and how it gets into groundwater. And the third one dealt with the history of the oral contraceptive. I see some people are laughing already. Yes, it's a good start. And it was dealing with the history of the oral contraceptive. So the whole idea of all three of the programs were to look at basic research. What is basic research about? Why does the government spend that kind of money on basic research that maybe doesn't make sense to the average voter, and help them to understand why that money is being spent? We did the program. We used Red Barber, who is was the voice of the New York Yankees for several years, and he was our host, the on-air talent. He lived in Tallahassee. He was also the same age as the population trying to reach, so we thought we'd have that type of connection. We videotaped everything. It went very, very well. And then what we had to do is we had to decide whether, how we were going to field test this with that population, find out how much they learned from what we did on these TV programs. So keep in mind, we've got overfishing of high fish population area, we have misuse of pesticides, and we also have the history of the oral contraceptive. So what order would you want to put those in? Well, David Owens and I decided, since we were graduate students, we're going to be real theoretical. So we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food, shelter, that type of thing. Dr. Berkman, being a scientist, said, we need to teach them about scientific inquiry. And Dr. Gagne cut right to the chase, and he said, people would rather have sex than fish. Now, he actually didn't say it that way. He said it, for those of you who know, he said it differently. But anyway. Well, we lost it. Let me tell you, we really lost it, because here's my idol, and he's talking about sex and the senior citizen. I never thought that. We had some other one. I had another wonderful story, and this was one that was kind of real personal to me. My parents had a car that had a push-button transmission. It was a Dodge Dart, and it had a little push-button transmission. It was made for several years. Dr. Gagne had one as well. He had a Plymouth Valiant, and my dad, when I was a kid, had a Dodge Dart. And I saw this out in the parking lot. Dr. Gagne is getting into the car, and I just walked up to him and I said, my dad used to have a car just like this with a push-button transmission. And he said, get in. I said, what? He says, get in. So I get in, he drives me around campus. We come back about 10 minutes later, and I said, what was that all about? And he went, relive a memory. It was great. I mean, but here's one on the theoretical side. This is really gonna diffuse everything you know about. I asked him one time in class. It was basically a seminar, just a discussion in one of his classes. And I raised my hand and I said, are your theories actually empirically proven and valid? Because I really don't know. And this was very early on, by the way, because when I was there, they were just finishing up the ISD model. And he leaned over and he said, heavens no, that's why we have graduate students. So that's how that was empirically proven. I'll tell you what happened to me also in another personal vein on my doctoral, and I'm sure a lot of students have gone through this, on my defense. He asked me a question. I was very nervous. I had a very powerful committee, and he asked me a question, and I did know the answer to it. I really did, but I just couldn't bring it to say it. So Dr. Berkman, my major professor, answered the question and said, Stuart knows the answer to this, and then proceeds to tell him the answer to my question just to prove that I knew the answer. So Dr. Gagne looks at me and he asks me the next question. And I stared at him, and he stared at me. He went, well? And I said, ask Dr. Berkman. He didn't. And he said, good answer, even louder. hey, you diffused them. I taught you well, you know. So anyway, I got just actually a couple more. I've got one more that Dr. Berkman. This is another one that also involved him. His nickname was Buck. I mean, the faculty in the informal meetings used to call him Buck. And I was privileged to be on a committee that was, I forgot who chaired the committee, but it was a curriculum redesign committee for Florida State in the program. And what we wanted to do is they wanted to get student input as well as faculty input on what we can do to improve the program. So as one of the graduate students, and I think David Owens was another, there was a third one, they all wanted to know what we could do to improve the curriculum. So we suggested that they should really talk about other theorists and other important people in the instructional design field other than those who teach at Florida State University, like Dr. Merrill, for instance, to really give a balanced program. And we also said, because we wanted to get him going, get Dr. Gagne going a little bit, we said, so we're really talking about, Dr. Merrill, Romaszowski, everybody, and also Piaget and Carl Rogers. And if you know him, I know some of you, you're laughing, you find that he really would not be favoring Piaget and Carl Rogers. So he got very, very animated. He said, I would rather have Piaget than Rogers. And Berkman said, Bob, I think he meant Buck Rogers. So, anyway, I'm sure there's a lot of faculty and students that can tell you a lot more stories. In fact, we were talking at lunchtime at the luncheon about some other stories. I hope you'll tell the one you told. Okay, maybe you won't. But anyway, they've had their time, and I want to just echo the fact that because Dr. Gagne made his mark on our field, we've been very, very successful for it. Thank you.
Well, I'm also going to continue in some of the storytelling tradition and start with my first meeting with Bob Gagne was when I interviewed at Florida State a little more than 20 years ago. And of course, I already knew much of his work because the conditions of learning had been required reading for me as an undergraduate, and I worked for a time as an instructional designer and had his little Essentials of Learning book, which was a real handy book to give my staff when we were doing instructional development kinds of activities. So I came to Tallahassee from the Northeast, so I flew in and sort of wondered where the town was. And Walter Dick was the chair of the search committee, and he met me at the airport. And one of the very first things he said to me, now this is the first time I had met Walt, and we're chatting about it, and he's kind of going through what my day is going to be. He picked me up about 9 o'clock in the evening, and I would interview all the next day, and he said, well, you understand that if we hire you, you're going to be to replace Gagne. And I thought, oh my God, the pressure, and of course, as Bob Morgan said, he really, truly is irreplaceable. Well, I met Bob the next morning, and we actually went to lunch together with Walt Dick. Now, you have to kind of picture this. And we're actually pictures I want to draw your attention to here up against the podium. These are archived photos from Florida State's lab. And you have, those of you who have never seen Gagne, he was a very big man, okay? I mean, kind of much bigger than me, and big man. And Walter Dick at that time was driving a basic blue Toyota Corolla that was a single door thing that wasn't double doored. And so we went to lunch. Gagne insisted on sitting in the back seat. And so you can imagine him kind of wedging himself into the back seat. And he finally gets situated, and he's got one hand on Walt's seat and one hand on my seat and his face between. And we're talking along, it's going to lunch, and all of a sudden Bob says to me, he says, what do you think people learn from television documentaries? And I thought, oh no, trick question. I really truly didn't have a clue. I had no idea where this question came from or what he really expected me to say. But it was my first introduction to Gagne's incredible curiosity. He really was interested in what I had to say and how I'd respond to it. Well, it turns out, it might have been David Owen's dissertation, I'm not sure. He had a student doing a dissertation, and he said, well, I'll tell you. They learn about 50% of the okay. but I came away with that with this real sense of his incredible curiosity and respect, I think, for his colleagues, where he would from time to time come in the office and ask a question that was sort of almost off the wall, but in fact he was just interested in various things, and so he'd come in and ask these kinds of questions. Well, he invited me to be a co-author on his Essentials of Learning for Instruction book, and it's one of those things he indicated to me that he wanted the teacher's perspective. I was working with some pre-service teachers at the time, and he felt I had something to contribute. Like Morgan indicated earlier, though, I mean, I certainly felt that same trepidation and just awe that I'd been asked by Gagne to work with him. And I thought, my goodness, his prose is so elegant and his writing is so clear. I didn't think there would be anything that I could bring that would contribute in any measurable way. And yet I was terribly flattered that he had asked me to do this. And when we started to work together, it was an amazing experience because he wrote amazingly fast. I write fast. I tend to draft quite rapidly, but he worked much, much faster than I did. And we exchanged chapters. We divvied them up, and he wrote half, I wrote half, and then we would exchange our drafts. And I remember thinking that how could I improve on what he wrote? And yet every suggestion that I made for revision, he immediately took. He said, "Oh, that's a good idea." And most of the suggestions that he made for my writing, I mean, I thought were sort of brilliant. And yet it was this very humble sort of approach that he took to working with a lot of his faculty. I remember thinking as well that if he ever were to write with a computer, he would be completely unstoppable. But he was someone who tended to be rather impatient with mechanical kinds of things, which many of our colleagues knew. And that leads me to a story that I wasn't going to tell because I thought this was Stuart's story. And I don't know that this was something I actually experienced with Bob. I did travel with him some to AERA. But I actually think it was something another student mentioned to him. And they knew that when Gagne traveled, he tended to be very impatient with airports and things that you have to do in airports. I can't imagine what it would be like for him today in today's world. But now remember, this is AERA. And this is a 5-day-long convention. And one of the things that you actually see in the pictures, Bob always used to wear this gray suit that was with a white shirt, sort of rumpled. And often by the end of the day, the shirt tail would be partly out and maybe a button unbuttoned. And just he looked like your typical absent-minded professor. Well, this student, and I don't recall who it was, when we got to the destination, said to Bob, "Well, Dr. Gagne, if you're trying to be nice, if you'd like me to if you give me your claim check for your luggage, I'd be happy to go get it for you." And Bob sort of chuckled and says, "No need, got it right here," and lifts up his briefcase. One of the things I remember very much about Bob when we did travel together and to AERA is he had a real penchant for fast food. And I can recall one day in the office, he asked me to go to lunch with him. And I said, "Well, where would you like to go?" He said, "No, you choose, you choose." And I said, "Okay." So I named a place that was sort of had good, healthy alternatives. And Bob's face just fell. So I said, "Bob, where would you like to go?" And he said, "Wendy's." So from then on, I said, "Bob, anytime you want to go to lunch, why don't you give me 2 or 3 places you'd be willing to eat, and I'll pick from one of them." But whenever we went to AERA, that's the very first thing he would do, is scout out the nearest McDonald's. And it was something he just loved, fast food. One of my favorite AERA stories, and I have to tell you this, is something I tell my students in my class. I teach a learning class. And this actually I have several stories related to the learning class. When I was first hired there, Bob and I actually did team teach. We had very different teaching styles in that Bob was very much of sort of the old world lecturer, a wonderful lecturer, somebody you could sit and listen to for quite a long time, understand what he had to say. He was extremely clear. He was interesting to listen to, but it was very much of a didactic kind of style, whereas mine tends to be more of an interactive style, where I really want to engage students in conversation. And so it was an interesting tension for us to work together in the same class. And there were times that the questions would somewhat take him a bit off guard. And I recall one of the questions, like the one that Stuart mentioned about Piaget, that almost always came up because we taught, this was the course that Bob had put together, we taught Gagne, we taught Brunner, we taught Skinner, we taught Ausubel. We did not teach any Piaget. And so one of the questions invariably somebody would ask is, well, why don't you include Piaget in this class? And immediately you could start to see the red in his face, and he goes, because Piaget is a developmental theorist, not a learning theorist, a developmental theorist. And of course, by this time, he looks like he's about to explode. The poor hapless student simply shuts up. Another occasion, I was teaching a course that was a doctoral seminar, and we were talking about research in theory development and model development, and I asked Bob to come in and talk about some of the thinking that went behind the development of his instructional theory. And one of the students asked a question that and just said, well, Dr. Gagne, how did you come up with this theory? And he kind of paused and looked thoughtful for a moment and kind of shook his head. He says, you just think it up. But at AERA, one of my favorite stories was a panel that he and Bob Glazer were asked to debate. And it was a moderated kind of debate where I think there were some canned questions. And then they were asked to sort of go at each other. And so Bob Glazer kind of went first. And Glazer says to Gagne, Bob, why do you think there are 8 kinds of learning? And I assume that the 8 comes from one of the early editions of the Conditions of Learning, where the taxonomy hadn't reached its final stage. And immediately Gagne says, there aren't 8! There are 5! 5! And so Glazer said, well, okay, why do you think there are 5 kinds of learning? And again, Gagne kind of sits there in puzzlement for a minute and goes, because that's all there is. But that is something that when I talk to my class about Gagne's theory, because I do think this is one of the contributions that he's made to the field, is an integrative and comprehensive theory. And one of the questions I ask is that all there is? And it's often very difficult as we think about potential examples of learned capabilities to come up with any that cannot be classified using Gagne's taxonomy. And I haven't yet seen a real clear example. I think there's some that perhaps are borderline, but I think that's a lasting contribution that he's made. I think I'd like to end at this point with simply saying that Gagne certainly had an impact on my thinking. He continues to have a lasting impact on my thinking and on the field. I believe his theory is something that is still very useful today. It hasn't yet supplanted, I don't think, been supplanted by other theories. Certainly others are competing. But he had an incredible mind, and he was someone that was very, as I mentioned, very, very curious. And so I think he would be happy to be challenged, to say, well, is that all there is? And I think that's a challenge for us as a field to take his work even further.
Okay, we're moving from Tallahassee to San Antonio. When I met Dave Merrill and Bob Gagne at the same time, in fact, in association with a project at the Air Force Armstrong Research Laboratory called the Advanced Instructional Design Advisor. Bob, I think, was wearing that same suit and hadn't washed the shirt, and of course he was wearing the tennis shoes that he always wore when he wore suits. And I thought I'd just tell a couple quick stories. I'm not going to take very much time, and then we'll leave the last word to Dave. But 2 things struck me about Bob, or a number of things. One was his inquiring mind. He had basically retired from Florida State, and came out of retirement. So he hadn't really retired. He remained active, quite active. I had come from a different field, from philosophy, then to computer science, and then to this field. And I had a number of philosophy books on my shelf, and he asked me, what should he read? So the first week he was there, he read Hume's Treatise of Human Nature. The first week, I mean, this is an enormously thick book. He would absorb things. He was interested to find out new things. He spent an incredible amount of time talking to the many young scientists and technicians that worked at the lab. He was very generous with his time. I remember on one occasion, we were visiting aircrew training facility in Phoenix, Arizona. Driving around, this was a case where he wasn't looking for fast food, he was looking for a steak. So Bob also was a carnivore, he liked steak. We were looking for a particular restaurant that he had visited before Black Angus. Was the picture that he remembered, and he thought it was the name of the restaurant. It wasn't. We were lost. And I was driving around lost in Phoenix trying to carry on a conversation with Bob, and I was struggling with how to design computer-based instruction so that it wouldn't lose student interest, which we knew was happening in a lot of cases. And I tried to initiate a conversation. What would make a particular interface attractive, memorable, and so forth? And he came back with an answer that didn't really seem quite right. It was too mechanistic. If you had things balanced and the colors were clear and the objects were distinct, that kind of answer, you can imagine Bob saying that things had to be clear and distinct and readable, and it seemed like, well, I wanted more. So I said, well, what makes a poem memorable? And he gave the same kind of answer, rhyme and meter. Pounded his fist, as he usually did. And so he knew the answer, rhyme and meter. Well, I said, well, isn't there something more? Tell me a poem you remember. And so then he proceeded to recite, without hesitation, Edgar Allan's poem, The Raven, which is a very long poem. It's about 5 pages long. So this really struck my curiosity. He's in his 70s, and he remembers this poem word for word. It just happened to have been my favorite as well. So I said, well, were you forced to memorize this when you were at Brown or Yale or sometime in your career? No. When did you learn it? He had met Pat, and they were dating, and he was not sure how romances go, and he was reading different authors, and he chanced across Poe when he was in the library. And he committed this poem to memory. And 50 years later, driving around lost in Phoenix, he's able to recite the entire poem. He just had an incredible mind. One other short one, and then I'll pass the microphone to Dave. When we were at the laboratory, we worked on this project, the Advanced Instructional Design Advisor. And Bob his office was next to mine, and his task was to direct the building, the construction of what we called a case-based advising approach to instructional design. So we would have exemplars of computer-based instruction that we knew worked, and then we would have an elaboration of the rationale for when that particular design was effective, what the designer was thinking, and why things were done certain ways. The other project that we had underway in parallel with that was a system Dave Merrill designed, which was really to eliminate the instructional designer, to automate the process as much as possible. So we were trying both approaches. And then one of the things we did with Dave's work was we connected it to a database that had all of the content material for F-16, or F-18 electrical avionics subsystems. So we had technical descriptions of the radar in a database. We had troubleshooting procedures, and then we would have a subject matter expert, a technician, say, I need to provide some refresher training for this particular newcomer out of the tech school on removing the radar from an aircraft, for example. The system would generate the instruction on the fly. And I thought, well, this is wonderful. And Bob is sitting next to me, so I took this achievement. I said, isn't this wonderful, Bob? Here we even conducted a test. We had a human expert designer do the same tasks. It took him 3 months that the computer did in 3 minutes, basically. So, and you can't tell one from the other, you know. And Bob's response, and this really stuck with me, it wasn't at all interesting what the computer did. We understood how the computer was able to do that. The interesting thing was how that expert designed that instruction. That's what we need to find out, Mike. So I was excited about the wrong kind of thing. But he had such a gentle way of telling me that I was walking down the wrong path. So we owe a lot to Bob. Okay. And I got kicked off the project and Bob stayed.
I'm very honored to be here. I think especially since I was never really a student of Bob Gagne, but I don't suppose there's anybody in the professional field that has had more influence on me than Robert Gagne has. And I thought I'd trace just briefly the history of my involvement with Bob. I'm in it to tell all the funny stories, and I'm certainly not going to try to imitate him after Marcy. In 1964, I was in graduate school, and I wrote a paper that I thought was extremely insightful called Two Kinds of Learning, and I submitted it to my professor, Jack Adams, who said he thought it was also very insightful, and said that perhaps I'd be interested in reading a manuscript that he had just received to review called The Conditions of Learning. And so I read The Conditions of Learning in manuscript form in 1964, just before it was published, and I wrote a letter to Bob Gagne, who was then at Berkeley, and said that I was very excited about his book, but very frustrated that he'd just written the book I intended to write. So that was my first introduction. A few months later, I went to my very first professional convention. It was the Southeast Psychological Association, and met in New Orleans. And I went to present my dissertation study that I was working on, and there were 3 people in the audience. I don't remember who the other 2 were, but one was Bob Gagne. And after that meeting, Bob and I sat and visited about my dissertation for about 30 minutes, and that was my really first association with Bob. Subsequent to that, because of the contributions which he had made, and especially the conditions of learning, we were always trying at BYU, when we were trying to get BYU on the map, to get seminars at AERA and AECT and other meetings. We always invited Bob Gagne to be on our seminar. So I can't tell you how many different panels that I served on with Bob over those years, and that was a really great experience. And so he had a tremendous influence on me and on my students during those years. I suppose the really highlight of my career with Bob was in 1987 when I first went to Utah State University. And when I got there, they knew of my association with Bob and said, we would like to have a debate between you and Bob Gagne on instructional design theory. And I said I refused to debate Bob Gagne for several reasons, one of which I knew I wouldn't have a chance. And second, I said, I don't disagree with anything. There's nothing to debate. I said, I don't have any disagreement. I do not see my work as contrary to what Bob has done. I said, but I would be delighted to have a discussion with Bob Gagne. And so they said, well, if you want to call it a discussion, that's okay. We'd rather call it a debate because it would sell better. And I said, no, I don't want a debate. I want a discussion. This was a very interesting arrangement. It happened to be on my wedding anniversary on July 10th. I remember that. My wife said this was a very interesting way to spend an anniversary. We were on a raised platform. There were about 200 people in the audience. We were both seated in an armchair with an overhead projector next to us. And so we were where we could touch one another, and then on the outside of our armchairs were the overhead projectors that were behind us, and they videoed this discussion. This went on, we had 4 90-minute sessions throughout the day, where we just sat, the 2 of us, and talked, and then at the end of each of these sessions, we had a set of questions. Now, if any of you would like to view that, it's on video, and if you will send me an email, that video is available. I know some of you have that. But the video was heavily edited, by the way, so the videos are only about an hour each. But that was put on video, and subsequently, the essence of those discussions were published in Ed Technology in 7 consecutive issues in 1990, I believe. Is that what it was? Sorry? I think it was 1990. But any resemblance to what's in Ed Technology and what was actually said, I would invite you to read and listen to the video and then read. And because there's almost no resemblance, because by the time Bob got through editing what it said, the 2 things are quite different. But this was a great experience for me, and I think I remember very strongly in the second hour. It was not really adversarial, but a kind of a debate format in the first hour. And in the second hour, as I was talking about my ideas about knowledge structures and so forth, Bob turned to me all of a sudden, put his hand on my knee, and he said, "You don't really disagree with me, do you?" And I said, "No, Bob. All I've ever tried to do is say what you said or should have said." He said, "Oh, you got carried away in the last category." Which is probably true. Subsequent to that, the next day I said to, he was getting a little along in years at those point, and I said, why don't you stay one more day? We'll go up to my Bear Lake cabin and we'll just sit and relax in the sun before you fly home. And he agreed to do that. So the next day we had a very informal, lovely day sitting on the deck, just chatting about all kinds of things. And during the afternoon he said, he said, if you and I could get together and agree on some vocabulary, we'd really influence the field. And I thought that was very nice for him to include me in that tweet. And I said, that's a great idea, let's do that. And he said, let's find a way to get together. Well, subsequent to that, Eric Roberts and some others arranged for Bob Gagne and I to meet at the American Academy of Science for an entire week. Just Bob and I across the desk from each other with a recorder, and Eric in the room, and to have a conversation about instructional design. And our agreement was that we would come up with some vocabulary we could agree on. And so we talked for 6 hours for 5 days. This is 30 individual hours. That's probably more than all these graduate students got with him. And what a great opportunity that was for me. It was a little frustrating, however, because the end of every day I thought I'd really convince Bob about some things. The next morning we'd be right back to where we were the previous morning. But we had a really wonderful conversation, and at the end of that, we agreed on one vocabulary word, which no one had used before, enterprise. And so we weren't successful in our goal, but we had a tremendous opportunity. The really sad part for that to me was that all of the audio recordings of that, when I got home, I put them in the recorder, and it went. No one had checked the mic, and the technician that we had recording these, so I have a box full of recordings, 30 hours of conversation with Bob Gagne, none of which is audible to me. So I mean, some of you are really great audio technicians who may want to look at that. Maybe it could be resurrected. So, nevertheless, that was a great opportunity. We decided to write about our discussions. And so I wrote the first draft of this, turned out to be about 65 pages long of our discussions, and sent it to Bob for editing. It came back, it was 11 pages long. I then rewrote it and sent it back. It was about 50 pages long, and it came back and it was 9 pages long. And subsequently it was published, and it's included in the Legacy book, the book on enterprise, which I think was an important contribution, and I was really thrilled that I could be a joint author with Bob along with some of his students. Also subsequent to that, we went to Florida State to replicate what we had done at Utah State, and they again wanted to pose this as a debate, and this time Bob said, no, I will not debate Dave Merrill, and we had a great discussion about knowledge objects and about learning objects and some of the things. This is before the learning objects got famous. And we had a great discussion there at Florida State as well, and I don't know if that was ever recorded, I don't think so. And subsequently, I was meeting in his office, and I talked to him, and I said, Bob, you know, I'm trying to push you to go to computerized versions and how we represent knowledge for computers. And he drew a line on a piece of paper, and he said, what I've tried to do, he said, is to present recommendations for designers that live designers could use. He said, I'm not too interested in putting things on a computer. But he said, I think that this is a great way to go. So he said, he shoved the paper over in front of me, he said, so you take it from here. So I felt like that was a really kind of handing off of the gauntlet. Let me just quickly close by summarizing some of the influence that Bob has had on my work. In 1964, when I read the manuscript copy of The Conditions of Learning, I thought it was the most important book that I had ever read in this field, and I still do. I think that The Conditions of Learning are the classic, and I'm disappointed when people don't still read it. I think it should be required reading for every instructional designer. I think it is one of the classic works, and that work is still extremely important. Component display theory, my own word, was really an attempt to clarify the conditions of learning. I just felt like there were some things that for me were not as clear as they could have been. We came up with a two-way classification. We came up with a notion that I thought the conditions weren't as clear as they could be. My father was an artist and always taught me that you could paint any picture with a red, yellow, and blue crayon, so I thought we ought to come up with primary presentation forms that we could clarify Gagne's condition. But in fact, component display theory was really an attempt to clarify the conditions of learning. Elaboration theory that I worked on with Charlie Reigluth, and Charlie went on to really extend a great deal, was really an extension of hierarchy analysis. Charlie and I worked on extended task analysis, and elaboration theory grew out of our trying to deal with hierarchy analysis and how it worked, and we thought that there needed to be more than what was in the literature. So these are some of the things I thought Bob should have said, and as we moved into that area. More recently, we worked on transaction theory, which was an attempt to capture in an algorithm, in a computer algorithm, those conditions of learning for various learning outcomes. So we tried to automate that and to capture it. And then more recently than that, we worked on knowledge objects, which was really an attempt to take the type of outcomes and make it more explicit and to talk about how we could represent it. So almost all the work that I've done has really been an outgrowth of Gagne. And finally, the most recent work that I've talked about recently is First Principles, where we've looked at a lot of theories and tried to look at the principles they have in common. And the thing that we've decided there is that really effective learning is problem-centered. This is not to be problem-based. We make that distinction. And as I looked again at the article that Bob and I wrote on Enterprise, I said, oh my gosh, this is exactly where I got that idea from. And so I really have been influenced in my career by Bob Gagne. And Bob, if you're here today, thanks for the contribution you've made to my career. And remember, all I ever did was say what you said or should have said.
Well, that was definitely an interesting hour. I want to thank everyone who contributed to this, all of you. Wonderful stories. And thank Bob. He is here, and I'm sure he was laughing the hardest at the stories we told about him. Marcy?
I guess I have nothing else to add except to extend my thanks for all of you for coming and celebrating this with us.
Rita had her